From the top, everyone. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Global Regulatory Frameworks for Safer Gambling, What's Changing and Why. My name is Niamh Gallagher, Marketing Manager here at Mindway AI. So first and foremost, I want to extend a huge thank you to the European Gaming and Betting Association for their support in helping us bring this event to life as part of Safer Gambling Week 2024. So a big thank you to Barry and Martin. So there's been a lot of buzz this week, obviously around safer gambling. It's a crucial opportunity to reflect on the work that we do together to create a safer gambling, more sustainable gambling environment. So we're delighted to be able to contribute to this important conversation. So we have an engaging session ahead, exploring the shift in regulatory landscape and its implications for safer gambling practices. Our speakers will touch on the latest developments, share insights on these changes and shaping the future of our industry and participate, and in particular in markets of Ireland, Finland and Brazil. So before we dive in, just a quick few housekeeping notes. So this webinar is being recorded. So we'll share the recording after the session. We do encourage you to ask questions at any point during the webinar using the chat function. We'll also have some time at the end for additional questions. So without further delay, we'll get started. It's my pleasure to welcome our panel. I'll let you all briefly introduce yourselves. You can turn your cameras on, give a quick bit of background information on yourselves. So Barry, you're actually on the top left-hand corner of my screen, so I'll let you go first.
Thanks, Niamh. I'm Barry Grant. I'm an addiction counsellor based in Ireland. I'm the project manager with a project called Extern Problem Gambling, which was originally Problem Gambling Ireland, which was a small charity I founded back in 2016. We merged with a large charity called Extern about 5 years ago. And our primary focus is to prevent and minimise gambling-related harm in Ireland. We provide helpline services, we provide a free counselling service, we do harm prevention talks and workshops in schools and universities. We're also a campaigning organisation, so we're registered as lobbyists, and we would have been lobbying for the last 9 years to get the gambling regulation bill over the line, and it was enacted a couple of weeks ago, so that was a bit of a win to see that actually happening in Ireland. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Thanks.
Okay, great. Anna Barbara, do you want to go next?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Ana Bárbara. I'm from Brazil. I'm a regulatory lawyer. I've been working in the regulation of Brazil since 2020. So we are very happy that finally we're going to launch our market in January. We hope, right, Stephen, that everything goes fine. But so far, we are very pleased with the results. I'm a consultant to the Brazilian Lotteries and Gambling Association, and also a regulatory director for a group of operators in Brazil. So thank you.
Thank you. And Sarah, if you can go next.
Yeah, hi, my name is Saara Kuusela and I'm from Finland, and I work for a private company called Commit, and we are actually a software company, and we've been working with the Finnish regulators the last 20 years, and we got a new contract with the regulator for next 8 years as well. So we are kind of a team of 20 people doing software projects for the regulator. So we are working between the monopoly operator vehicles and the regulator. And now when the market changes, our role is going to be quite big on that as well for the licensed markets. And obviously, as a software company, as a private company, we are heading also to the operator side. So we are trying to create connections and the operators and to make it easier to connect the Finnish market.
Okay, great.
In 2027.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and Steve, do you want to go next?
Last but not least, how you doing, everyone? My name's Stephen Opie. I'm Business Development Manager for Mindway AI. I've been with Mindway AI for a little over 1.5 years now, but for the last 7 years, I have been working in the responsible gambling space. My previous remit was working for a company called Gamban, which is gambling blocking software. So previous kind of interests were based around enhancing national self-exclusion or self-exclusion within a gambling operation. So it's great to be part of the conversation today.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for being here. So obviously we have a lot to get through here. So I suppose over the past year, we've seen some big changes announced in regards to safer gambling regulation kind of all over the world. But Anna Barbara, I'll go to you first. So what specific challenges in regards to player protection do you anticipate in the Brazilian market as it goes live with its gambling framework?
Thank you, Nayam. Well, I don't know if you all are aware that in Brazil, we're facing 3 unconstitutional lawsuits before our Supreme Court, especially about the problems that the gambling activity is creating to the players regarding mental health or ludopathy and gambling disorders, and as a result, conducting to the indebtedness of Brazilian citizens. And according to those lawsuits, this kind of behavior is affecting the other sectors of our society, of our economy. Okay, so we have these 2 issues. First of all, regarding the mental health or ludopathy, and the second one regarding the financial consequence of such ludopathy. Last week, we had a first preliminary decision in which the Supreme Court, of course, kept our betting law, but addressed that we have to have a better control of our players, meaning especially the vulnerable ones, the minors, and those that are part of the social benefits in Brazil. But the discussion is not over. We are continue to submit to the Supreme Court all the arguments and what is the strategy of the industry? I'm not talking only about my trade body, but the other ones. We are all together working in the same sense. Is what we see. So what we see. And what we are going to do to better address such issues, to avoid the mental health problems and the financial health problems. First of all, is as everybody is doing all over the world, is to improve our onboarding tools, notably regarding the financial capacity of the players. Currently, we can have access, of course, respect all the GDPR disposition and provisions, and so we can better assess our players, not only regarding the indebtedness, but also regarding to prevent AML. Additionally, we, in our law, in our regulation, following what we have seen is the best at practice all over the world, we put the mandatory setting of limits, meaning the operator must provide to the players to set limits, but it's not mandatory that the players set their limits. And that's going to be why we are very concerned in Brazil, as other jurisdictions, regarding the illegal market, and to do not create, mainly in the beginning of the regulation, too much friction and put everybody and keeping the bettors in the illegal market. The third one, and it's also part of the decision that I mentioned about the Supreme Court, it's about responsible marketing and how we're going to deal with all the loyalties and bonus programs. That is another action that we are also developing. And finally, but not the least, in our ordinance, we put, and the regulator put as a mandatory obligation of all operators to monitor the players' activity and act timely to prevent addictions. And this is one of the key issues, and the key issue, and in my personal opinion, what is going to really be the real solution to avoid addiction and avoid all those externalities that are not positive for our society and for the gamblers.
Okay, thanks, Anna Barbara. It sounds like there's a whole host of things there to consider. So I'll move over, Barry, to you. So Ireland has recently overhauled its regulatory framework. How do you think that this will impact players going forward?
Well, there's a lot of beneficial stuff in there. I mean, Ireland has a long history of legalized gambling going back to the 1920s, 1930s, legislation from the 1950s. So we needed a major overhaul. I mean, while gambling was legal, there was zero regulation. Many politicians, including the ministers who were responsible for bringing in the regulations, refer to it as the Wild West. And that's a pretty accurate description of the total absence of regulation in the Irish market up to this point. Mm-hmm. So in an unregulated market, unfortunately, some operators will engage in a race to the bottom. That's just the nature of good old fashion capitalism. So hopefully we will see less of that, because we will have an organization there with oversight. So that's the first thing. We'll have a regulator that's empowered to oversee the market. It will have, Barbara mentioned, illegal operators there, or offshore operators, or unlicensed operators, black market, grey market, whatever name you want to put on it. Obviously, that's going to be a big part of their remit. And what we would see in our work with people who have gambling problems is that if they end up in those kind of black market spaces, that's where a lot of the real harms can happen, because the kind of supports that will be available with the more reputable kind of household name operators are just not available in those kind of black and grey market spaces. So we'll see a multi-operator self-exclusion scheme coming in for the first time for online. That's going to be a massive help to the people we work with, in combination with things like Gambam. We would imagine, like we've seen those types of coordinated systems in the UK. There's going to be a ban on credit card gambling, which we've already seen in the UK market. That would be really helpful. There's going to be, for the operators today, there might be some bad news from an operator perspective in terms of quite restrictive rules around advertising. There's going to be a pre-watershed ban from 5:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. On TV and radio, and essentially, which is something they kind of slipped in at the end, an almost total ban on social media advertising, unless a person should only see, under the legislation, so gambling advertising on social media if they follow a gambling operator's account, which is going to limit that greatly. But for the people that we work with, certainly people in recovery, that's going to help them quite significantly. But yeah, a lot of other stuff in there, but I could be here all day talking about. I'll hand it over. Thanks.
No, that's great. And yeah, sounds like there's a lot to touch on there, which we can come back to. And Sarah, so going east from Ireland to Finland, so Finland's moving to a more competitive licensing system. So what implications do you think that will have in terms of safer gambling?
Well, I think in the positive impacts, there's definitely two positive impacts. One is this generalization rate. And currently in Finland, we have the generalization rate is between 50 to 60%, and we expect it to be somewhere between 70 to 90. So that means that we are going to get more players on the regulated markets in the future, which is really good. And the other good thing that I find there is the data for research purposes. And this is the new legislation says that it's mandatory for the operators to send the gaming data to regulator in predefined format. And this is what we already have in Finland in place with Veikkaus. So actually in the monopoly system, we do get all the data. But the new thing with the legislation is going to be that the regulator is able to share this data to organizations doing the research on gambling. And this is a huge step forward in Finland. At the moment, with the monopoly market, the research organizations doing the research, they do have right to access the data from Veikkaus, but obviously it's not so straightforward to get the data when they need it, and also it's not necessarily in the format that would be easy for them to use. So this change, I think it's really big and it's really good also.
Okay, great.
And then,
go ahead.
Yeah. Then we have these somewhere good and not so good. There is a requirement of duty of care for operators, so they must automatically and continuously observe the player behavior and the problem gambling. But on the other hand, there is no recommendation on what are the minimum markers of harm or what is the quality of the tool they have to be using. So probably we'll see anything from really bad to really good in the future. But on the other hand, we have to remember that the regulator in Finland does have all the data, so it will be probably something, or I hope it will be something that the regulator will in future follow up and make changes accordingly to that. Then there is, of course, the negative sides, which are much bigger. It's commonly known that when the market is transforming from monopoly to licensed market, we are going to get more gamblers in Finland, and also it means that we get more problem gamblers. And currently, the helplines in Finland, they don't have fundings. They have queues. The people that need help, they are in queues for 3 to 6 months to get help. And if we get increasing numbers of these problem gamblers, but no funding to helplines, it's going to be a big problem. So hopefully this is something that our government is putting attention into afterwards. And then another thing that I find really kind of to be seen and negative side on this one, for the average Finnish player who has been used to play with Veikkaus, so it's going to look like a Wild West, this thing, when it opens, because the marketing is practically not limited at all in Finland. So when the market opens, there will be loads of marketing from licensed operators, but also from the unlicensed operators. And I don't see how a player is able to differentiate between the unlicensed and licensed operator, as there is no IP blocking, no payment blocking, or no landing pages recommended on the legislation. And also bonuses for new players, they are not allowed. But obviously, the unlicensed operators, they will use bonuses to attract new players. And that is not a tool that the licensed operators can use. So I think that's going to be a big problem. Those two big problems, two good things, and one in between. Duty of care, I quite like it, but it should have been defined more precisely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Sounds like the regulator has a lot to deal with there. So, I mean, we see more and more markets regulating in recent years. So, Steve, like, how do cultural or market differences influence the adoption of safer gambling legislation, do you think?
Well, first and foremost, it's a large question. There's a lot to unpack with something like that. So for the sake of the webinar, as I'm sure between the four of us, we could discuss this for the rest of the webinar. I'll keep it short and sweet. I guess I'll start by saying one of the things that I really enjoy about working in the global responsible gambling space is that part of my job is to understand what the lay of the land is for any market that we step into. So before we step into a market, it's important that we kind of observe what's going on with the political climate. Is legislation moving towards safer gambling or against? And what is the regulatory climate looking like? What do the regulatory requirements for certain technologies look like, etc.? Every market around the world kind of comes with its own national perspective relative to how online gambling is regulated. And when we look into the adoption of, say, technological safeguards, I believe that there's a multitude of factors that actually influence safer gambling legislation. So I think that one of the most important factors actually boils down to the landscape of every market. So for example, if we're looking into a new and emerging market such as Brazil, or you're looking to dip your toes into more of a highly regulated or mature market like the UK that already has a strong legislative framework in place. To touch on Brazil very quickly, Brazil was previously a grey market for many, many years, which of course piqued the interest of some of the larger international gambling operators, who rightfully took the opportunity to kind of market and monetize towards the Brazilian population without any legislation or regulations in place to protect society. So Brazil currently today finds itself in a unique position where they're liberalizing and about to fully regulate. But it could be argued that because it's been a grey market for many, many years, the harms already exist. So this landscape, in my opinion, has actually led to one of the strongest the building of one of the strongest legislative frameworks towards safer gambling that we've seen from a new and emerging market. It seems that the government has taken more of a customer-centric approach and is really looking into all the technological safeguards and services that can be used from inception. Another factor that kind of influences safer gambling legislation is down to culture. We're in the global industry that has many different cultures. In fact, today, Brazil kind of reminds me of where Ireland was at 20 years ago. in terms of the public perception of gambling. So 20 years ago in Dublin, I would have been working for Paddy Powers as a sports specialist. And at that stage, all my friends were disappointed and telling me I need to get out of the gambling industry. There's no future there. And currently, from what some of the conversations I've been involved in Brazil, it seems there's a real public, a bad public perception of online gambling. So culturally, different cultures do have different attitudes toward gambling, which can significantly impact both the adoption and enforcement of safer gambling laws. So in some cultures where gambling is seen as a more socially acceptable pastime, this can actually lead to a climate that leads to more lenient regulations and enforcement. And if we're comparing that to societies that have viewed gambling negatively, that can actually breed a climate that gives more kind of restrictive legislation enforcement. Another core factor that's quite important to look into, at least from my perspective, would be the economic condition of a market. So if you're looking into a market, it's important that we look into things such as includable levels of disposable income, employment rates, and overall economic stability. These kind of factors actually influences gambling behaviors across an entire nation, and it can actually impact the regulatory approach to implementing legislation. Unfortunately, and historically, from what I'm actually seeing, there often tends to be a lax regulation around the implementation of safer gambling legislation in lower economical markets. So to give an example of this, if we were to look over to the African marketplace, Africa, the continent, is a really interesting market. It's vast, it's massive. It has one of the youngest populations on the planet. But unfortunately, African regulators prioritize the taxation of gambling over safer gambling legislation. And when you've got a young population that loves sports and partakes a lot in sports betting, it becomes really worrying when you've got a lack of safer gambling legislation. And if you look toward the east of Africa, the younger demographic is being impacted negatively by a lax in regulations towards safer gambling. And then I guess finally, the last thing I'll touch on is the level of political will in any market, which varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So Niamh, we're two Paddies based in the UK. In my opinion, the UK is by far the most political market that I've worked in. And in some areas, safer gambling legislation can be influenced by things such as public pressure and media coverage. And in some cases, if there's a high profile case of gambling related harm, whether it's a suicide attempt or something even more morbid as a suicide, this can actually drive swift legislative responses. And then when you look at other markets, you've got operator pushback and trade associations pushing back, which can actually slow progress towards safer gambling legislation. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Steve. So it sounds like it's quite a patchwork of political, economic, cultural factors in each different market. So looking at operators in specific markets, what would you say the biggest challenges? I'll go to Sarah on this one. What would you say are the biggest challenges that operators face in adopting new regulatory frameworks? And you know, the difference then for smaller versus kind of like big international operators. Oh, you're on mute, Sarah.
Sorry.
Happens to the best of us. Don't worry.
I think in Finland, the big steps that the operators have to take, all operators, the big one and the small ones, is definitely the communication with the regulator. That's going to be Finnish regulator works in Finnish language mostly. So of course English is understood, but it's much easier to operate with Finnish language with them. And also the problem when you're entering the Finnish market for big and small operators is going to be that Veikkaus can keep their customer base. So practically every Finnish person who gambles anything, they already have account with Veikkaus. So the new operators entering the market, they have to fight for the new customers with the unlicensed operators when Veikkaus already have those existing. And challenge for big operators, I think it should be more. It's going to be that this legislation is actually requiring sort of single customer view. So the operators in Finland in the future, they can have more than multiple accounts, but the deposit limit is mandatory and it's per license holder. And also the panic button in self-exclusions, it's also per license holder. So it's not per player account, which might cause some problems to operators to apply to their systems. And the next thing about the challenges is obviously going to be the time pressure. There is not loads of time, and there is things that has to be the data transfer to regulator, and how do they get it tested and approved before the market is opening. That's definitely something that is going to be a big issue. For small operators, I would say that the requirement of the duty of care is going to cause some problems, because maybe every operator doesn't have that one in place already. So they have to build something, and what is it going to be? So nobody knows. The big operators, they definitely have it already in place, so it's not going to be a problem with them. And then also in Finland, as the last one, is the parliament election in 2027. So when the market is opening in January 2007 latest, and we have election in April 2027. So it depends on how it looks at that moment. It makes some unknown to operators and risk that is it actually, do we actually have more regulation at that moment when the new government comes in? Do they want to regulate it more? Depends on how it looks, how the market is looking at that moment. And then actually, I forgot also we have B2B license, which is software license, and that comes to 2028. And operators start operating in Finland 2027, but the software license is only 2028. So how are the operators going to make sure that they are only having in their selection games that are going to get and will have the software license in 2028? That is going to be a challenge as well for the operators. Those are the picks that I got from this market in Finland.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, 2027 right now seems like quite a while away, but in terms of the gambling timeline, it's not really. And then obviously for suppliers as well, 2028. So yeah, a lot of pressure on there.
Yeah, there is actually, it's not long time thinking of the technical side of it. So
yeah. And Anna Barbara, I'll go to you. So this is the golden question. I'll shoot this your way. How can operators maintain a balance between regulatory compliance and providing, a competitive but also safe customer experience?
Thank you, Naim. I will answer your question in the same line that Sarah was talking right now. Here in Brazil, we have a very clear enemy, who is the illegal market. Currently in Brazil, we have mapped like 3,000 brands operating. Only like 300 applied for a license. So we are going to have a market to be shared among those that are regulated. So our main focus, so we can provide the regulatory and compliance with all the requirements, is if we have enough players providing enough economic movement in our operations, we will not need to be more aggressive to try to get more players. So the key, so here in Brazil, the key stuff is we have to keep the market to the regulated operators. Why only 300 operators applied for a license? Because we succeed with the government to put all the requirements very, very high. Since that you have to prove the source of your funds, you have to show that you have proper systems. As Sarah was telling, we put a lot, we according with the regulator, as Stephen said, our regulator is very, very focused in technology and systems. To provide those systems has a price. It's not anyone that can provide, even it's not any operator that can be approved by like a Mindway or anyone to provide such sort of a technology. So our first thing is what is legal and what is illegal. And Sarah, in Brazil, we address with the Congress and with the regulator two strategies. The first one, all the regulated operators will have the bet.br. That is a domain that only the government can provide. So anyone in Brazil will know if you are legalized or not if you have the domain bet.br. That is a part of the license that we are going to pay. The second stuff that we address very, very firmly with the government and with the Congress is about advertising and publicity, and notably, Barry, in the social medias. We are, here in Brazil, we have a self-advertising, self-regulation council, as you have in Europe, all over Europe. And we are discussing with them and with the international advertising in Brazil, that is like the association of Meta, Facebook, and Instagram, how we can block the advertising of the legal operators, not us. We are developing all these kind of standards. So first of all, to answer your question, we'll be able to fulfill all the requirements if we are economic able to fulfill. So if we have players enough, so we can manage our cost and so in a very economical, sustainable way. And in the second point about as Sarah said, also in Brazil, we have this monitoring issue, but they do not put very clear what are the indicators. Some operators that have experience and have the system, they have a very, very strong policy with a lot of friction, that it's not fair that they are doing it properly, and other operators, new operators that could apply for the license, could be approved, they do not have, and these operators they do not monitor enough their gambling activity, and we have a lot of discussion, a lot of problems after, because they do not monitor properly their operators. In this sense, and I would like, Nayon, to thank a lot of Stephen, because he's helping the industry a lot in Brazil. We're addressing with the Ministry of Health, jointly with the regulator, what would be these KPIs that everybody must at least monitor. It's not finished yet. Stephen did a wonderful work, and we hope, right, Stephen, that in 2 or 3 months we're going to have this standard of how we have to monitor how the operator must monitor their database and their players' activity.
That was my question about how long, but I mean, 2-3 months is quite fast, actually, in my opinion. So that's good news. I'll continue on. Barry, I'll direct this one to you. So, you know, the gambling industry is a tech-led industry predominantly, as you mentioned, Steve, earlier. What role do you think technology, particularly AI, can play in safer gambling and compliance with new regulations?
So I probably should have mentioned this at the start. I'm on the expert panel for Mindway, so I've been doing that for a few years as a consultant. It's not my main day job, but I do occasionally do that, and it's really interesting work. And just in answer to your question, just in that context, having sat down with some of these data sets that are sent out by some of the companies, and as an addiction counselor who works with people on the front line every day, a person in counseling can tell me, well, I stayed up through the night and I gambled and I lost my wages, or maybe I lost my month's wages or whatever. But human memory is flaky. And it's not the most reliable thing in the world, right? But when I can sit down and I can see the exact data points of this person logged on Tuesday night at 8 p.m. and they gambled until 5 a.m. on Wednesday morning, and they lost X amount of money and they did X amount of bets. And even with, okay, obviously I have training, but you could train a person very, very quickly with the human eye to see these markers of harm very quickly as they're kind of laid out on these data points, as in the way that Mindway collates them. And obviously people on the expert panel like myself would manually score those data points for the markers of harm, and then that teaches the AI, and then the AI scans through the gambling operator's system to track those markers of harm. And what the point, I am getting there. The point is, there's so much data being generated globally by the amount of players. And look at the US market is in its infancy, and that's already whatever crazy amounts of data, let's say, that's being generated there all around the world. The Brazilian market coming online, all these markets coming online, massive, mind-boggling amounts of data being generated every minute of every day. You could not possibly conceivably track that without AI. Like I don't, and I'm a bit of a techie, but that's not my profession. I'm interested in technology, but I cannot conceive of another way that this could be done. And all regulators are going to start looking for this markers of harm thresholds because they know it exists, they know it can be done. The UK regulator was doing it 10 years ago. They're all going to do this if they're not already doing it. So, sorry, that might have been a very long-winded, but I just wanted to give some context on it. Like, I don't see another way to do it without AI. I just don't know how it's done. But that's my 2 cents as a non-technical person.
Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, Barry set it up nicely there for me. I guess like the biggest application of AI in our industry is centered toward responsible gambling. From a Mindway perspective, our biggest challenge is all about identifying and supporting players who might be at risk. AI has emerged as a game changer toward responsible gambling. It's revolutionized the ways that the player can actually be interacted with in a more personalized level, and actually ensure more of a safe and responsible gambling environment. As you touched on there, Barry and Anna, a lot of regulators I know from the conversations I've been involved in are now looking to kind of harness the power of AI and machine learning, and have started to build more of an interest around the early detection of problematic gambling behaviors in real time, and understanding what impactful interventions can actually do. So they're understanding how impactful interventions can actually drive positive and sustainable gambling behaviors across an entire marketplace, if done correctly, of course. And as you mentioned earlier, Niamh, yes, we are all working in the tech space, and the gambling industry is perhaps one of the most innovative and fastest moving industries in the world. So currently, when it comes to remaining abreast of regulations and compliance, which today seem to move faster than anything else that we can keep up with, AI again plays a pivotal role. So regulatory bodies around the world are starting to tighten the rules around player protection, AML, and data privacy. And AI actually helps operators by automating these kind of compliance checks so they can stay abreast of the forthcoming regulatory changes in various markets around the world. So in my opinion, the integration of AI into our industry is a win-win scenario from a responsible gambling perspective. It's a win-win for the regulator because solutions like ours, for example, bring industry sustainability. The operators like it because they can communicate more personalized with the player and actually retain a player in a socially responsible manner. And then the player gets the benefits of actually gambling in a more safer gambling ecosystem. So yeah, I guess the punchline is technology will continue to pave the way in our industry.
Yeah, at a rapid pace, I think.
Yep.
And a big part of regulation obviously is around marketing and advertisement. So how are advertising restrictions evolving in these markets, and what operators need to watch out for? Sarah, I'll go back to you to touch on this first.
No, well, in Finland, the marketing is, like I said, it's going to be pretty much free. It's really open. The only thing that is actually not legal is affiliates. They are not allowed, but everything else seems to be there for business to do. Go ahead. Obviously, there is no marketing at the time that the kids are watching the TV or targeted marketing to kids, and there is no marketing. You can't do marketing on sponsoring or influencers that are mainly targeting the minors. So those are kind of obvious things, but otherwise the marketing is pretty open in Finland. So a bit too open in many opinions.
Yeah. Okay. And Anna Barbara, what about in Brazil?
As I said, we have some restrictions, as Sarah said, regarding minors. It has been enforced by the Supreme Court and by the National Secretary of Consumers' Rights recently. So far, we can still have a marketing as can be alcohol. Gambling and alcohol in Brazil have the same way of advertising. So we have some restrictions of time, some restrictions regarding TV programs that are focused on minors, but it's not a big deal. What we have here, so far it's still free with this restriction regarding minors, but our main problems really is the legal marketing of illegal operators. So that's our focus now, and what we are addressing with the authorities and with all the ecosystem of the advertising. So to keep us being able to advertise ourselves, the regulated operators, and we can restrain the access of the consumers to the legal market. That's what we are looking, and what the Brazilian authorities are working along with the operators to put in place.
Okay, thanks. And Barry, you mentioned earlier about Ireland having specific times for advertising. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, when the newly enacted legislation comes into force, which could be next couple of years realistically, the proposal is for TV and radio ban from 5:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. Again, with the idea that I suppose children wouldn't see or hear it. But the big one that this wasn't actually something that we were lobbying for, so I was surprised to see it. It only came in right at the very end, was the social media one, because as far as I can tell, most of the spend, or certainly whatever you're advertising, you're going to get more bang for your buck by targeted advertising on social media, because everybody's glued to their social media 24/7, and you can target demographics and interests and all sorts of stuff. So it makes sense to spend most of your money there. And what the government put in the final draft of the legislation, and it took me about an hour to figure out what this actually meant, because it's quite convoluted in the way they expressed it. But if I've understood it correctly, it would mean essentially a total ban on social media advertising of gambling, with the exception of when the individual social media user follows a gambling company's account on a social media platform. That would be the only circumstance under which a person would see any gambling advertising, legal gambling advertising on social media in Ireland. Now, the nuts and bolts of how that's actually going to work, I don't know. I remains to be seen how practical or realistic that essentially ban is going to be. But that's probably one of the strongest parts of the bill in terms of how far the government were prepared to go. So yeah, they'd be the two main points in the Irish context at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. And just staying with you, Barry, so obviously, compliance is the first step, but how do you think, from your experience, can operators proactively support RG initiatives and go beyond the requirements?
That's a difficult one. I mean, say in the Irish context, some are already doing it, in fairness. So let's say some of the interventions that are in the new Gambling Regulation Act would mirror interventions that have already happened in the UK market. I imagine that for many of the bigger organizations and conglomerates, like Entain and Flutter and many others, it makes no financial sense to them to have a UK way of doing things and an Irish way of doing things, because the Irish market, while gambling is very popular here, is so small relative to the UK market. So like when they brought in a credit card gambling ban in the UK, many of those operators just introduced it into the Irish market, even though there was no legal requirement to do so. So many of the operators are already doing that. They're already kind of ahead of the game in terms of what the new regulator and the regulations would expect of them. But without knowing enough about what every operator is doing, I don't know if I can answer the question any better on that.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, obviously, with the close, obviously, geographical and kind of political relationships there as well. So, yeah. And Steve, going back to you, so obviously you've been in the industry a while. What would you say, like, what innovative approaches to RG have you seen succeed in other markets?
Okay, I guess that would bring me back to my previous role with Gamban. Just for the audience attending, Gamban is gambling blocking software. a very basic but highly effective tool that helps people abstain from re-entering gambling. It blocks gambling content on all of the devices. Okay, as you can imagine, trying to sell gambling blocking software to gambling operators was very, very difficult. So over, say, a 6-year period, we've had to adopt how Gamban was engaging with the industry. So at that point, we decided to kind of go for a regulatory approach and position Gamban as a tool to supplement and enhance self-exclusion schemes. So one of the most kind of innovative approaches that I'm happy to say I was involved with was around an approach for self-exclusion, which is called the layered approach to reducing gambling-related harms. So this approach encompasses a national self-exclusion scheme, a centralized self-exclusion scheme, gambling blocking software, and a national gambling helpline. This was initially trialed, and the campaign still exists today in the UK back in 2020 with GamStop, GamBan, and GamCare. But the whole principles of how this works is it's all about creating as much friction as possible for anybody to re-enter the gambling space after they've self-excluded, okay? So the centralized self-exclusion scheme acts as a mechanism to prevent people or block people or exclude people from gambling from the licensed marketplace. When somebody self-excludes, they automatically get a free GamBan license, which is gambling blocking software. And this kind of mitigates the unlicensed presence at a device level, meaning that, yes, the centralized self-exclusion register blocks that person from licensed gambling, GamBan blocks from unlicensed gambling, and then you've got a national gambling helpline, which offers different forms of cognitive therapy and treatment and services. But the whole important thing about the layered approach was about having a no wrong door approach. So wherever that person has presented who's experienced gambling related harm, whether it's through the helpline or through GamStop or GamBan, we would then signpost that person to whatever they needed, whether it was gambling blocking software or treatment or to self-exclude. So that approach, like I said, started in 2020 in the UK, and then it extended over to Norway, Finland, and most recently Ohio. In Ohio, there is a campaign taking place, a self-exclusion campaign called, I forget the name of it, but it's one of the most innovative approaches to harm reduction I've seen in the US. You're kind of struggling with the idea of industry sustainability at the moment. So yeah, I was very happy to be part of that, and I'm happy to see its continued success today. So.
Yeah, and just staying on the kind of point of innovation, what trends do you see in player protection regulation? I mean, that operators should prepare for maybe in the next 3 to 5 years. So stay with you, Steve, on this.
Wow. Well, you know, if we look back to 2005, so to answer this question, I would say that regulators really need to keep their fingers on the pulse of innovation and where the industry is going. And I'll use the use case of 2005 in the UK gambling industry. The Gambling Act has been recently reformed in the UK, but previous to that, it hasn't been changed since 2005. 2005 was actually the birth of the smartphone, and nobody realized the migration that would happen from physical gambling into gambling in a digital setting. And I believe if the regulators are keeping their finger on the pulse of innovation, they could have had some foresight or expected something like that to happen. What I currently see is a rise in augmented reality and virtual reality. Today, graphics and AI and technologies have become so smart and so intelligent that we can actually achieve photorealism. So I foresee virtual reality in particular, with the Oculus headset, moving to the forefront of the industry. It begs the question of, like, where do the harms come from next? Because if somebody is sat in their living room with a headset, and once they put the headset on, it feels like they're in a real life casino. What are the ramifications? So I think regulators need to keep their fingers on the pulse of what's coming next. And I personally think VR is going to be moving to the forefront pretty soon. So.
Okay, thanks. And Sarah, you had mentioned before about centralized data with the regulator. So, you know, how do you see that as something that operators need to kind of prepare for in the coming years, like 3 to 5 years?
Well, we are close to Christmas, so I have a wish list. And I would really I would really look forward to see that we have some sort of a centralized duty of care, and I would like to see that the regulators take more responsibility on duty of care in total, and other things that I think we should be looking in near years is we already have centralized this self-exclusion coming to Finland, at least. And so I would assume that at some point we should be heading to the point where we actually have centralized limits as well for the player. So there's one place where player can set their own limits or details, give their details, and that is used by all operators, rather than every operator having a separate limits for each player. So that's something that I'm looking forward and hoping to see in the future with the regulators.
It's on your Christmas list.
Yeah, that's my Christmas list.
And Barry, just going back to you, so this is talked about a lot. I've seen it come up on, numerous conferences and editorial pieces, but do you foresee a move towards greater harmonization of safer gambling regulations internationally? And if so, what would it take to achieve that?
I think it would be good to see, because it is a global market. We did an Erasmus Plus project a couple of years ago with similar projects in Norway and SOSPED in Finland, and at the time, while Norway is still a monopoly situation, Finland at the time was a monopoly, and it currently is moving towards a a free market approach. But in both of those countries, there were issues with a lot of the people who access the addiction services were accessing the whatever unlicensed overseas grey black market, whatever you want to call it. So it's a global situation, right? Like online gambling, while it should on paper respect borders, that isn't what happened. Anna Barbara mentioned it, 300 out of 3,000 have applied for licenses.
Yeah.
So that's a lot who are operating without the license and not respecting the jurisdictional licensing regime. So I think we have to look at it globally. There's no other way to do it. Even in Norway, which has the strictest monopoly of them all and lots of rules, you can't withdraw winnings from an unlicensed operator to your Norwegian bank account, and still people will gamble with these unlicensed operators, knowing that they can't cash out their winnings. We need a joined up way of dealing with this, and it benefits the licensed operators the most. Right?
Yeah.
It's in the interest of licensed operators to stop unlicensed operators eating their lunch, essentially. And unlicensed operators generally don't operate at the same level. We spoke about duty of care. You don't tend to see so much of that in the unlicensed space. So everybody benefits from having a joined up global way of looking at it. And that's probably my 2 cents worth on it. I have to jump off the call real soon to get into a counselling.
No problem.
Just to give you a heads up on that. But that would be my 2 cents on the global way of looking at it. And just briefly, I'm on the National Standards Authority of Ireland committee. We are looking at that with other similar organizations in Europe to try and agree on codes of practice. So that is happening at that kind of codes of practice level, maybe not a regulatory level.
Okay, yeah, wheels are turning at least.
Yeah.
You actually beat me to it, because I know we're nearly out of time, but if there is any questions from the audience, feel free to put them in the chat. But just to wrap things up, I'll ask each of you, if you could prioritize one area for regulators to focus on in the coming years in terms of safer gambling, what would it be and why? And I'll go to you, Anna Barbara, first on this.
Thank you. The first thing I would what the regulators are already doing is focus on our centralized self-exclusion list that they are developing. We really hope they can develop it soon. They did not promised to the beginning of the market, but I don't know, for March or April. And second, if we are able to develop this program of the minimum indicators of harms that all the operators shall monitor. We really believe as an industry in Brazil that if we behave and we take care properly of our clients, it will be the best for the industry, not only sustainability, but also to reduce further restrictions or further friction that may be imposed by the regulator. So that's why we think it's so important that we can focus in properly monitor and get in touch with our maybe problematic gamblers so we can avoid the problems, and then we can have a really profitable and sustainable industry for the future.
Okay, thanks, Anna Barbara. And Barry, I'll go to you next because I know you need to jump off. What would your one area for a regulator to prioritize?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of caught maybe between a single customer view, which I think probably benefits the people that we work with the most. You know, if there was some practical way of doing that everybody could agree upon. I know there's a lot of challenges in doing that. Plus, the other one is having a market, you know, like Anna Barbara spoke about there, you know, in an ideal world, each jurisdiction would have its own gambling domains that are distributed only by the government. And then everybody who is operating within that market is operating within the regulations in that market. And then we could really talk about safer gambling because the playing field is level. Everybody's doing the same thing. If there's some, I don't know, in this modern age of VPNs and all the different tricks that we can use to kind of get around borders, if there's some way of doing that, I think that would have a really big impact as well. I better run. Lovely
Go for it. Thank you, Barry. Yeah, thank you so much.
For logging on. Take care. Bye-bye.
And Sarah, I'll go to you next. The same question.
Well, it's been heard many times that, well, I'm a software company, so I think the data is the key issue everywhere. So you have to get all data. So with the data, you have the power to do just anything. And in the future, the regulators, they should also start discussing about how can we make the market in such way that it's really easy for all operators, all sizes of operators to connect. And it has to be easy, but it has to be also at the same time, it has to be really protective on the players. And I absolutely believe that this is possible and you can make it easy and at the same time really safe market to gamble.
Okay, thank you. And Steve, to wrap it up.
To wrap it up, I guess I'd touch on Barry's point of single customer view. I touched on it very briefly earlier, but it feels like regulators are starting to build more of an interest to understand how AI systems can actually give them deeper regulatory oversight for an entire marketplace. So I'd like to see that go ahead in specific markets around the world. The other thing that I would like to see be adequately tackled, because it pisses me off to constantly hear the same topic of channelization. Regulators and governments around the world, the tools do exist to actually prevent unlicensed operators from entering a marketplace. All you really need is a blacklist, a whitelist, and a good relationship with internet service providers to actually enforce them into action to prevent that. So I would like to see more of a stronger emphasis from all regulators against tackling the black market, because it can be done. So
yeah, I like that positive note to end on. So I think we'll leave it there. So Sarah, Anna Barbara, Steve, and thank you to Barry for a really great discussion. Thanks for everyone for joining us today on the webinar. It's been a privilege really to host this discussion as part of Safer Gambling Week and have so many different jurisdictions represented here. And lastly, thank you once again to the European Gaming and Betting Association for their support. So we hope you found the insights shared today useful, and just a reminder that we'll be sending out a link to the recording as well. And if you have any follow-up questions, we can put you in touch with any of the panelists. So thanks again for your time. We hope to see you all soon. Have a great day.
thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.